Prince William has made a move that, on the surface, looks almost too ordinary to matter. There was no confrontation at Buckingham Palace, no public statement, no dramatic announcement from Kensington Palace, no photograph of William and Camilla sitting across a table while an argument unfolded. Instead, the change appeared through administration. A framework for the next reign began circulating among the people responsible for household planning, succession logistics, property arrangements, and the future organization of the crown. And buried inside that framework was a principle with consequences for Camilla. The current structure would not automatically continue when Charles's reign ended. The residence could be reviewed, the staff could be reviewed, the patronages could be reviewed, the communications machinery could be reviewed, and the institutional position of the Queen Consort would not simply transfer into the next reign because it had existed in the previous one. Charles was reportedly left with very little to say. But the detail that made the situation even harder for him was not the provision affecting Camilla. It was the provision affecting Catherine, because Catherine, according to this dramatized reconstruction, had accepted that the same rule should apply to her. If William died first, Catherine would face the same institutional review. That single decision changed the argument. It turned what could have looked like a personal judgment against Camilla into something much more difficult to challenge. A proposed rule for the architecture of the monarchy itself. And that is why this matters. Because if William is preparing the next reign this way, the transition may not begin on the day Charles dies. It may already be underway. Before we get into the details, if you're new to Palace Source, subscribe so you can follow where this develops. This channel looks beyond the obvious headlines and examines the decisions, signals, and institutional changes that can shape the British royal family long before they become public. And in this case, the quiet details may tell us far more than a dramatic announcement ever could. To understand the significance of the proposed change, it is necessary to separate three things that are often treated as if they were the same. There is the royal family, there is the household, and there is the crown. They overlap, but they are not identical. A family relationship can continue regardless of who occupies a particular office. A person can remain a member of the family even after their official duties have changed. But a household is an institutional structure, and institutional structures exist because the reigning monarch decides how the work of the crown is organized. That distinction is easy to miss when watching the royal family from the outside. A photograph of a royal residence does not tell you who controls its administrative operation. A public appearance does not tell you which office arranged it. A patronage does not necessarily tell you whether it is permanently attached to one person. And a staff member who has served a royal for years may still ultimately work within a structure that can be reorganized when the crown changes hands. That is the foundation of the issue. Camilla's current position exists within Charles's reign. The next reign will belong to William. Those two facts are simple. The difficult question is what should happen in the space between them. Historically, the monarchy has often relied on continuity. It has preserved arrangements because continuity itself has value. Senior members of the family have sometimes retained substantial public roles after the circumstances that created those roles changed. The Queen Mother is an obvious historical example of how a royal widow could remain highly visible and institutionally active for decades after the death of the monarch. But history is not a binding instruction. It is a collection of precedents. And precedents can be followed, modified, or abandoned when the institution changes. William has grown up watching that institution change repeatedly. He has seen the monarchy become smaller. He has seen the press environment become more aggressive. He has seen every public decision analyzed almost immediately. He has seen how quickly a family disagreement can become an institutional crisis. He also knows that the future crown will have fewer working royals available to absorb responsibilities. That creates a practical incentive to make the hierarchy unmistakable. Who speaks for the crown? Who represents the monarch? Who controls the central household? Who determines which offices continue? Who decides how public resources are allocated? Those questions may sound administrative, but they become intensely personal when they affect members of the same family. That is where Camilla's position becomes unusually delicate. As Charles's queen consort, she occupies a role created by the present reign. The title carries immense symbolic importance, but the institutional machinery surrounding that role is not necessarily permanent. The title and the household are related, yet they are not the same thing, and the proposed framework takes advantage of that distinction. It does not need to say that Camilla has done something wrong. It does not need to accuse her of overreaching. It does not even need to mention her by name. It simply says that a change of sovereign creates a new household structure. Once that principle is accepted, the consequences follow naturally. That is the strategic elegance of the approach. It removes the emotional argument. If William had announced that Camilla would have no future role because of their personal history, the palace would immediately face questions about motive. Every old family dispute would be reopened. Every photograph from the past would be examined. Every disagreement would become relevant. The story would become personal. But an institutional framework is different. An institutional framework can be defended as planning. It can be described as efficiency. It can be justified as preparation. It can be presented as responsible succession management. That does not prove the personal history is irrelevant. It simply means the personal history is no longer necessary to explain the decision. And that is precisely why Charles would have difficulty resisting it. The document itself is important less because of its title than because of the language it uses. In the dramatized scenario, it was called the Household Continuity Framework, Reign Transition Provisions. That title sounds almost deliberately uninteresting. There is no emotional language, no reference to Camilla, no mention of conflict, no suggestion of punishment. The language is procedural. That is exactly how a sensitive institutional decision can be made difficult to challenge. The central idea is straightforward. At the commencement of a new reign, the incoming sovereign's household becomes the primary institutional structure of the crown. Existing arrangements can be examined rather than presumed to continue. That means continuity becomes something granted through a decision, rather than something assumed through habit. For Camilla, that distinction could be enormous. Suppose her current staff has spent years learning her schedule, managing correspondence, and coordinating public engagements. Under an automatic continuity model, much of that machinery would simply remain in place. Under a review model, every position can be reconsidered. Some staff might be retained. Some might move elsewhere. Some roles might disappear. New positions could be created around the new king and queen. The difference is not necessarily whether Camilla has people around her. The difference is who has the authority to decide. That is where power lives. The same principle applies to property. A royal residence can carry personal associations for decades. Furniture can remain in familiar rooms. Staff can become accustomed to the rhythms of the household. Visitors can associate the address with one particular member of the family. But none of those things necessarily establishes permanent institutional ownership by the person living there. If the next king decides that a residence is needed for his own household, or for another official purpose, its future can be reconsidered. Again, the decision can be made without ever saying that Camilla is being punished. It can simply be called a reallocation. The distinction may sound cold, but cold language is often the language of institutional survival. And there is another category that matters: patronages. Patronages create public associations. Over time, the public learns that a particular royal supports a particular cause. That association becomes part of the royal's identity. But patronages also have to be managed. There are limited appearances, limited staff resources, limited public attention. If the future king wants a smaller monarchy, he may decide that patronages should be concentrated around fewer working members. That would naturally increase Catherine's public footprint. And this is where the transition could become visible before anyone announces it. Catherine does not have to publicly replace Camilla. She only needs to become increasingly prominent in areas where Camilla was previously prominent. One event becomes two become 10. The public begins to associate the cause with Catherine. Eventually, the institutional memory changes. The future arrives through repetition. This is why the next 60 days, or the next several months, would be more revealing than a single palace statement. The question is not simply whether Camilla attends an event. The question is what pattern develops around her. Does her diary remain strong? Does she continue receiving prominent assignments? Does she maintain the same number of public engagements? Does her office remain unchanged? Do her patronages remain concentrated around her? Or do responsibilities begin moving elsewhere? None of those developments, taken alone, would prove anything. That is important. Royal diaries change for many reasons. Schedules shift, events are cancelled, responsibilities move, people age, the institution constantly adjusts, but several signals appearing together can become meaningful. That is how an insider would read a transition, not through one photograph, through a pattern. There is another reason the document's self-application clause matters so much. Catherine's inclusion removes one of the easiest criticisms available to Charles. If William created a special arrangement for Camilla while protecting Catherine from the same rule, the document could easily be portrayed as a personal weapon. The argument would be obvious. William is not creating a principle. He is creating an exception for someone he does not want to continue supporting. But if Catherine accepts the same restriction, the political and institutional argument changes. She is effectively saying that the future queen should not receive an automatic guarantee either. That is a remarkably powerful position. It suggests that the institution should not become dependent on the assumption that a royal spouse has permanent access to a household, simply because they once held a particular position. Catherine would be accepting uncertainty about her own future in order to establish certainty about the institution. That is precisely the kind of move that can make a controversial restructuring appear principled. It also reveals something about how William and Catherine may think about the monarchy. Their approach is not necessarily about removing people. It is about defining the center. The crown has to have a center. If too many people have their own staff structures, offices, residences, and public agendas, the institution becomes harder to explain. A smaller monarchy can be more coherent. The public knows who matters. The media knows who speaks for the institution. Staff know where authority sits, and the monarch can make decisions without negotiating every operational question with a parallel household. From that perspective, William's move is not necessarily an attack on Camilla. It is a preemptive attempt to prevent the next reign from inheriting a structure designed for the previous one. That is a significant difference. Imagine the alternative. Charles dies. William becomes king. Catherine becomes queen. Camilla remains active with an established office. Her staff expect continuity. Her supporters expect continuity. Charities expect continuity. The public expects some continuity. William then announces a reduction. Immediately, every reduction becomes a story. A staff member leaves, and it is interpreted as a dispute. A residence changes, and it is interpreted as humiliation. A patronage moves, and it is interpreted as retaliation. A missed event becomes evidence of a family conflict. The palace would spend months explaining what it could have prevented by setting expectations earlier. William's proposed framework solves that problem before it happens. The rules are known in advance. No one is being singled out. The transition is built into the architecture. That is why the quietness matters. The quieter the change, the less material there is for a confrontation. Camilla could disagree with the outcome. Charles could disagree with the degree of change. But challenging the principle itself would be much harder. And that brings us back to Charles. Because Charles has another option. He can try to establish continuity as a value before the transition occurs. He can speak about the importance of experienced senior royals. He can emphasize that the monarchy is a family as well as an institution. He can celebrate long service. He can reinforce the idea that public roles should not be discarded simply because the crown changes hands. None of those statements would directly challenge William, but they would create a competing philosophy. Charles would be defending continuity. William would be defending clarity. And Catherine would be demonstrating that clarity applies even to herself. That is a very sophisticated family tension. Nobody needs to shout. Nobody needs to accuse anyone. The disagreement can exist entirely inside the words they choose. Charles might say that tradition provides stability. William might say that the institution must adapt. Charles might emphasize experience. William might emphasize a smaller structure. Charles might speak about family. William might speak about the needs of the crown. The public could hear three speeches and never realize that they were part of the same argument. There is also the personal question that cannot be completely removed from the institutional one. William has a history with Camilla that predates his own marriage. That history is inseparable from the story of his parents. For William, Camilla is not simply another senior royal. She is connected to a period of his childhood that became public property. But William is now an adult. He is a husband, he is a father, and he is the future king. Those roles demand that he separate memory from governance. That does not mean the memories disappear. It means they cannot be allowed to determine every institutional decision. This is precisely why a formal framework would be useful. It gives William a structure within which personal feelings become less relevant. He can say that he is following a rule. He can tell staff that the rule applies universally. He can tell Charles that Catherine is subject to it as well. He can tell Camilla that her future role will be considered respectfully, but not assumed. That is a very different posture from revenge. Revenge needs an opponent. Institutional redesign only needs a rationale, and William's rationale is easy to understand. The next monarchy cannot be built entirely around the relationships of the previous one. Every reign creates its own priorities. George VI's monarchy was not Elizabeth II's monarchy. Elizabeth II's monarchy was not Charles' monarchy. And Charles' monarchy will not be William's monarchy. That is the nature of succession. The crown continues. The structure around it changes. The danger comes when people confuse continuity of the crown with continuity of every arrangement surrounding it. William may be determined not to make that mistake. He may believe that the monarchy needs to be designed for the conditions of his own reign rather than preserved as a museum of Charles's. And Catherine's presence strengthens that argument. She represents the future generation. She is part of the public image William is building. Their partnership has become central to how many people imagine the next phase of the monarchy. That does not automatically mean Camilla must disappear. It means there is less institutional space for overlapping centers of attention. The monarchy can accommodate senior family members. It becomes harder when several senior members are perceived as competing for the same symbolic territory. This is especially important in the modern media environment. A newspaper can compare two photographs in seconds. A social media account can create a narrative around two women attending similar events. A single headline can turn an ordinary scheduling decision into a rivalry. William cannot control every interpretation, but he can control the structure that generates some of those interpretations. If there is one clear central household, the message is easier. If there are two highly active royal households, the message becomes more complicated, and complexity creates opportunity for conflict. That is the strategic calculation. It does not require anyone to be malicious. It only requires someone to decide that one center is better than two. Now consider how Camilla would experience the change. The most difficult part may not be the loss of a specific residence. It may not be the reduction of staff. It may not even be the change in public visibility. It may be the knowledge that the person who will ultimately make the decision is William. During Charles's reign, Camilla's position is protected by the constitutional reality of the current crown. Charles is king. Camilla is queen consort. William is the heir. There is an obvious hierarchy. But when the reign changes, the hierarchy changes with it. William will no longer be waiting for his turn. He will be the person at the top of the institutional structure. That means every unresolved question between the generations becomes more immediate. The fictionalized delivery of the framework therefore matters. Imagine the setting at Raymill House. A quiet afternoon, the familiar sitting room, papers arranged on a table, the kind of environment in which an ordinary day can suddenly acquire historic significance. A senior secretary arrives with a formal envelope. The message is not personal. That itself communicates something. If William wanted to have a private emotional conversation with Camilla, he could have done so. If Charles wanted to warn her personally, he could have done so. Instead, the communication arrives through the machinery of the households. That means the issue has crossed a line. It is no longer merely family business. It is now institutional business. Camilla reads the covering note. The wording is respectful. She is being given an opportunity to see the proposal before the process is completed. But respectful language can carry an uncomfortable implication. The decision is far enough along to have a document. There are advisors involved. There is a process. There is a framework. There are people preparing for a future that has not yet arrived. And suddenly Camilla is not being asked whether she wants the future to happen. She is being told what the future may look like. That distinction would be difficult for anyone. For a person who has spent years adapting to the demands of royal life, it would be especially significant. Camilla has survived difficult public periods. She has learned how the institution works. She understands discretion. She knows that the most dangerous mistake inside a palace is sometimes reacting too quickly. So the silence becomes part of the drama. She does not need to throw the document across the room. She does not need to call the press. She does not need to confront William immediately. She can simply read it, absorb it, ask her advisors what each provision means, and wait. That waiting period may be more important than any immediate reaction, because Camilla's strongest weapon is experience. She knows that palace decisions can change. She knows that drafts can be revised. She knows that a planning document is not necessarily a final command. And she knows Charles. If anyone can persuade Charles to intervene, it would be the person closest to him. That creates the next stage of the tension. Charles must decide whether to fight for continuity. But any intervention carries a cost. If he pushes too hard, he could appear to be asking William to preserve privileges for Camilla. If he does nothing, Camilla may interpret that silence as acceptance. And if he appeals to family rather than institutional logic, William may simply return to the framework. That is why the father's position is so difficult. He has no easy victory. There is also a question about Princess Anne. If she becomes involved, her position would probably be different from Camilla's. Anne has spent much of her public life emphasizing duty over personal drama. Her loyalty tends to be directed toward the institution. That makes her potentially important in any transition discussion. She would understand the argument for continuity, but she would also understand the argument for a clear chain of authority. If William is establishing a more disciplined household, Anne is unlikely to oppose the principle merely because it makes individual royal lives less comfortable. Her question would be whether the new structure serves the crown. That is a very different test. It also helps explain why William's strategy could gain support among some experienced members of the family. A smaller structure does not necessarily mean less respect for senior royals. It means a clearer distinction between private family membership and official institutional responsibility. That distinction could eventually become normal, and once it becomes normal, it is extremely difficult to reverse. Institutions develop habits. Staff are recruited under those habits. Budgets are built around them. Schedules are designed around them. Public expectations adapt to them. That is why early planning matters. William is not simply deciding what Camilla will receive. He is deciding what future generations will consider normal. If the next reign begins with one central household and a limited number of working royals, the following generation may inherit that model as a matter of course. If the next reign begins by preserving several overlapping structures, the monarchy may continue to carry those structures for decades. William, therefore, has an incentive to settle the question before it becomes a crisis. This is where the title of the document becomes almost symbolic: Household Continuity Framework. It sounds as if its purpose is to preserve continuity, but the deeper effect may be to define where continuity ends. The institution continues. The people do not necessarily retain the same institutional arrangements. That is a subtle distinction. And subtle distinctions are often where constitutional systems operate. The public may never see the framework itself. They may only see its consequences. A staff member moves. A residence changes. An office is closed. A new communications team appears. Catherine takes on another category of engagement. William begins using different language when describing the future. None of these things needs to be announced as a major transformation. Together, however, they could reveal one. That is why observers should resist the temptation to focus only on dramatic palace moments. The most consequential royal decisions often arrive through small changes. The person who stops appearing, the responsibility that moves, the office that is renamed, the phrase that suddenly appears in speeches, the residence that is quietly reassigned. These are institutional fingerprints, and if enough of them point in the same direction, the underlying strategy becomes visible. Charles's reaction remains the emotional center of the entire situation. He is not simply reading a policy document. He is looking at a future in which his wife may no longer occupy the position he helped establish for her. He is also looking at a son who has decided to impose a rule on himself and his own wife. That makes the situation almost painfully logical. Charles could say that Camilla deserves continuity. William could respond that Catherine will not receive automatic continuity either. Charles could argue that Camilla's experience is valuable. William could agree, while still saying that experience does not require an independent household. Charles could appeal to tradition. William could say that tradition has never meant every arrangement must survive unchanged. The argument becomes almost impossible to resolve because both sides can claim to be defending the institution. Charles defends continuity. William defends adaptability. Neither position is absurd. The difference is generational. Charles inherited a monarchy whose central purpose was continuity. William is preparing to inherit a monarchy whose survival may depend on controlled change. That difference could explain why Charles sits in silence. He knows William is not merely reacting. He is planning, and planning is harder to defeat than anger. Anger can pass. A plan can survive. If Charles confronts William in an emotional moment, William can wait. If Charles objects to one clause, another version can be drafted. If Charles appeals to family, William can return to the principle that the institution must outlast the individuals. The only way to stop the framework completely would be to challenge the underlying philosophy, and that would mean answering a difficult question. Should a future king be required to preserve the household structure of the previous king simply because the previous king was his father? There is no obvious answer. Constitutionally, the answer points toward the new sovereign's authority. Emotionally, the answer is far more complicated. That is the tension at the heart of the story. William may be right institutionally and still find the decision difficult personally. Catherine may support the principle and still understand what it means for Camilla. Charles may disagree and still know that his son has a legitimate strategic argument. Camilla may be hurt and still recognize that the framework is not written as an attack. These contradictions make the situation more believable than a simple palace feud. Real institutional conflicts rarely divide neatly into heroes and villains. They divide people who are trying to protect different things. Charles may be protecting his wife. William may be protecting the future monarchy. Catherine may be protecting a principle of consistency. Camilla may be protecting the dignity and independence she has built over decades. Those goals can collide even when nobody intends a public war. The next stage would be watching what happens outside the document, because a document can sit in a folder for months. The real evidence would be operational. Look first at appointments. If William's future household begins recruiting people whose careers are clearly oriented toward his own reign, that is a signal. Look at the language surrounding those appointments. Does the palace describe them as part of long-term planning? Does it emphasize modernization? Does it talk about efficiency? Does it mention a streamlined operation? Those words matter. Then watch residences. A change in access arrangements may look insignificant, but access is never completely insignificant inside a royal household. Who can use a room? Who has an office? Who controls the diary? Who hosts official meetings? Who has staff based at a particular property? These questions reveal where institutional authority sits. A residence does not need a new flag outside it to become part of a different structure. The administrative reality can change first. Then there are patronages. This is perhaps the easiest area for the public to observe. If Catherine begins taking on causes that previously received substantial attention from Camilla, the overlap should be examined carefully. Again, one event proves very little. A pattern is different. If the new queen increasingly becomes associated with certain categories of work, the institution may be preparing the public for a new division of responsibility. The same applies to international visibility. Who accompanies William? Who appears beside him at major occasions? Who is used to represent the monarchy to younger audiences? Who is given the strongest visual position at major events? Royal symbolism is often built through repetition. A person who repeatedly stands beside the future king becomes associated with the future of the institution. That does not require anyone to push another person away. It simply changes the center of gravity. Camilla's own diary would therefore be particularly revealing. A gradual reduction would not automatically indicate conflict, but a reduction combined with increased responsibilities for Catherine would be harder to ignore. So would changes in the way the palace describes Camilla. Words such as queen consort, senior royal, family member, and supporting the king each carry different implications. Language establishes hierarchy. A royal who is consistently described in relation to the monarch is institutionally different from a royal described as having an independent public role. That is why every future statement should be read for what it includes and what it leaves out. The absence of a phrase can sometimes matter as much as its presence. There is one more strategic possibility. William may not intend to eliminate Camilla's role completely. He may intend to make it conditional. That would be a significant difference. Under such a model, Camilla could continue selected charitable work. She could retain some patronages. She could appear at certain family occasions. She could have appropriate support. But nothing would be automatic. Everything would be tied to the priorities of the reigning monarch. This would give William flexibility. He could preserve the parts of Camilla's public role that strengthen the monarchy while removing the parts that create unnecessary duplication. It would also allow him to avoid a humiliating public rupture. Camilla would not be told that she had no value. She would simply no longer have an institutional structure independent of the new king's priorities. From a strategic standpoint, that may be the most sustainable outcome. It gives the future king control without requiring him to create an enemy. It also gives Camilla a path to retain dignity. She could remain active because William chooses to retain particular roles, not because the previous reign automatically transferred them. That distinction would matter to both sides. For William, it preserves authority. For Camilla, it preserves agency. For Charles, it could provide enough continuity to accept the transition. And for the monarchy, it reduces the risk of two competing centers. This is where the scenario becomes more nuanced than the headline. Camilla has no place in the next reign can sound like a declaration of personal rejection, but the institutional reality could be much more subtle. She may have no automatic place in the next king's household. That is not the same as having no place in the family. It is not the same as being excluded from public life. It is not the same as being erased. It means the new reign begins with a clean institutional slate, and perhaps that is the real message William wants to send. The future king does not inherit every administrative obligation created before him. He inherits the crown. He decides how to organize it. That principle would apply to everyone, even Catherine. Even if Catherine's acceptance of the rule is partly strategic, it is still important, because the future queen would be signaling that the institution comes first. That is the kind of message that can resonate with an older generation of royal observers. Duty, restraint, consistency, service. Those are words the monarchy understands well. William would be using them in a modern way. The old system said continuity was a virtue. The new system may say consistency of principle is the virtue. That is a subtle but important evolution. There is also a psychological dimension to the way Charles may view William and Catherine together. For years, Charles has watched his eldest son prepare for the role he himself spent decades waiting to inherit. He has seen William change. The young prince who once had to be protected from the pressures of royal life has become a man with his own institutional instincts. Catherine has been part of that transformation. Together, they represent something Charles could not simply order into existence: a partnership, a shared public identity, a common approach to the future. That may be why the Catherine clause has such emotional force. Charles is not merely seeing a rule, he is seeing evidence that William and Catherine think as a unit. They are willing to accept constraints on themselves in order to establish rules for the wider institution. For a father, that can be both reassuring and painful. Reassuring because the future crown appears to be in disciplined hands. Painful because disciplined hands may make decisions that affect people Charles loves. This is the strange burden of succession. A parent raises a child to become independent. A king raises an heir who must eventually make decisions the king himself cannot control. The transition therefore contains an unavoidable emotional reversal. Charles once had authority over William's world. Eventually William will have authority over the institutional world surrounding Charles's legacy. That does not make William cruel. It makes succession real. And Camilla sits at the center of that reversal. She is part of Charles' legacy. William is deciding what portion of that legacy belongs inside his own reign. That is a question every successor faces in some form. Do you preserve the previous generation's arrangements? Do you modernize them? Do you combine the two? William's answer appears in this reconstruction to be clear: preserve the institution, review the arrangements, and make no automatic promises. That is a very controlled philosophy. The public reaction, if such a framework ever became known, would probably divide along familiar lines. Some would see it as overdue modernization. They would argue that the monarchy should be smaller, more disciplined, and centered around the sovereign. Others would see it as unnecessarily harsh. They would argue that Camilla has served Charles faithfully and should not be treated as disposable simply because the reign changes. Others would make it personal. They would connect the decision to Diana. They would revisit the past. They would search for evidence of old resentment. And some would focus entirely on Catherine. They would ask whether the self-application clause was genuine principle or simply clever political positioning. That debate could become enormous. But inside the palace, the practical question would remain simpler. What structure can survive? What structure can be explained? What structure can be funded? What structure can operate without constant rivalry? Those questions do not care about internet arguments. They care about institutional design. William's challenge is to build something that can function after the cameras move on. That means he cannot design a system purely around today's headlines. He has to think 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead, perhaps further. A decision made during Charles's reign could determine what becomes normal during William's reign. And what becomes normal during William's reign could influence George's future. That is the long game. It is also why William's strategic personality matters. He is not generally portrayed as someone who needs to announce every move. His most consequential decisions are likely to be communicated through structure, appointments, priorities, schedules, words, people around him. That is why calling him a chess player can be useful, as long as it is not taken too literally. The point is not that William is treating his family as pieces. The point is that he is thinking several moves ahead. A future king who waits until a crisis arrives has already lost some control over it. A future king who establishes expectations years earlier has more options. That may be exactly what this framework represents, an attempt to make the future predictable before the future arrives. There is a final layer that deserves attention. What happens to Charles's own legacy? Charles has spent his reign trying to establish his own identity as king. He has wanted his monarchy to be distinct from Elizabeth II's. He has pursued different causes. He has emphasized different themes. He has tried to make the crown reflect his priorities. William will eventually face the same task. If William simply preserves every arrangement Charles created, he will inherit Charles's monarchy almost intact. But if William changes too much, he risks making his father's reign look temporary. The balance is difficult. A good successor should preserve what works while changing what no longer fits. That is probably how William would justify the framework. He is not rejecting Charles. He is completing the transition from Charles's institutional model to his own. Camilla therefore becomes a symbol of the problem. She is deeply connected to Charles's monarchy. She is part of its history. She is part of its public image. She is also a person William must decide how to accommodate. That is why the issue cannot be reduced to whether William likes Camilla. The more important question is whether William wants the next monarchy to carry forward the structures that were built around her. The answer, in this scenario, appears to be no, at least not automatically, and that is a much more defensible position. It leaves room for compassion. It leaves room for selected roles. It leaves room for family, but it removes entitlement to institutional permanence. That may ultimately be the compromise. Camilla remains Camilla. The family remains a family, but the crown belongs to the reigning sovereign. And when the sovereign changes, the machinery changes with it. Now return to the moment when Charles first sees the framework. The room is quiet. The document is on the table. William and Catherine are present. Charles has read enough to understand the implications. He looks at the provision concerning the next reign. Then he sees the clause concerning Catherine. For a moment, the personal argument disappears. This is not William saying that Camilla is uniquely unsuitable. It is William saying that nobody should automatically inherit an institutional household from a previous reign. Charles may still dislike it. He may still believe Camilla deserves more. But the argument has changed. And perhaps that explains the silence. Sometimes silence is not agreement. Sometimes it is recognition. Recognition that the other person has built an argument you cannot easily dismantle. Charles could ask William to reconsider. He could ask for exceptions. He could ask for transitional protections. But he would be negotiating details. The principle itself would remain. That is a significant shift in power. The father can request, the future king can decide, and Catherine's presence makes the entire arrangement harder to characterize as personal. She is putting her own future under the same institutional uncertainty.